Okay, all right, let's make this full screen here. And we'll let people in from the waiting room as we go along. But hi, everybody. My name is Brendan Lange. I'm a psychometric specialist with the Office of Planning and Research at DESE. And thank you for coming today. Happy to be here with you to talk about the Views on Climate and Learning Student Questionnaire and talk about ways of interpreting and using it and all the aspects related to that. So again, this is being recorded, so we will send out a recording of it in the next day or two. We'll also send the slides, and we'll also, if by the end we aren't able to get to any questions, we'll certainly be sure to follow up over email. Okay. So on the agenda today, we'll start by talking about an overview of the vocal framework. We'll talk about how does scoring work, get an intuitive grasp on that. We'll suggest a workflow for working with the data that you receive. We'll do a little bit of a demo of the Edwin dashboard and reports to kind of set you up for using those. And we'll leave off with contact info for me, additional resources, and then answer whatever questions we can by the end, okay? Okay, we'll start with a framework overview here. Now, the vocal questionnaire, student questionnaire, is inspired quite a bit by the work of the U.S. Department of Education school climate surveys. We kind of like adopt their framework or much of their framework for doing this work. The idea here is we're trying to estimate something about the school climate that's defined by these various dimensions: engagement, environment, and safety. And then within each of those, there's topics that further kind of give context or define those dimensions. And so the items that the students see, they are aligned with these topics and these constructs that we're trying to estimate. Now, let's kind of like almost backwards plan a little bit and just understand what you get out of this. And many of you are familiar with this, but if you're new to working with the vocal data, there are two data sets that you receive that we report out. One is a set of index or scaled scores, and you can think of those as high-level summarizations of student response patterns on the survey. So, and those ranges 1 to 99. We also report out item response rates, so the number of percent of students responding to the various response categories on the questionnaire. And these come in two different formats. One is a dashboard, which is a package visual enhancement of the data that you're able to use for various purposes. And then a set of spreadsheets or tabular reports that are nice in that they give you a lot of power for customizing local reports on your end. And we don't report the individual student scores. What we do is we take the aggregates, or in this case, the means, the averages at the school, district, and state levels. And we do this also for the various student groups that we have data on. So the different grade levels, the economic status, disability status, gender, race, and whether you're learning English as another language. Going back to the framework, there are some definitions here of the different topics, but any of the elements here with a red star, these are scores that are calculated since 2018. And then the blue starred items are topics, and in 2022, a set of items was added for those topics to make them long enough scales to make us feel confident about reporting a scaled score out for those. Whereas the other topics there, they might have only a few items associated with them. Really, the goal there was to be able to report more information out. So I will say that this program of reporting scores out and getting information to you is an ongoing process. And so the current state is not the final state. And over time, we'll likely be able to report more in improved ways, right? So with my transition into the position, at the time at which reporting happened, things got started a little late this year. But generally, you can expect preliminary dashboards and reports by early July, and by mid-September we have final reports. Those item additions in 2022, again, really aimed at being able to report topic index scores. Now, we only report them currently for what we call the all students groups within a school, district, and state, not for the other subgroups or student groups. But here's some examples of the items, and we do have various suppression rules in different places that are noted on the dashboard and in the reports. And for the reporting out the topic scores, you really do need a sample size of at least 50 students to be able to have a topic score reported. Now, you'll recall that those topic scores are within those various dimensions, and we added items. So what does that mean for the dimension index scores across time, right? The idea here is that those dimension index scores, the comparability is maintained year to year. We're just adding new information and getting a more reliable estimate. And so the comparability of the dimension scores, even though we've added items, remains consistent. So let's talk about next, try to get a little bit of a grasp on how this scoring works, and in particular, the index scores. So again, VOCAL is just a student questionnaire. It's a series of statements. You'll see on the left-hand side an example. These are statements that define a positive school climate. It's things we would want to see in a positive school climate. And we ask students to think about the last 30 days. And this questionnaire is administered alongside the MCAS at the end of the year. So we keep that in mind. But they're asked to think within the last 30 days. Tell us how true is it that these statements about your school climate are true? How are they in place? And they have these response categories to work with, from never the case to always true. Now, the goal here is to try to understand some with index scores, or finding a student score on this questionnaire, is to summarize at a high level, how were they responding across the items, to give us just a quick, nice indicator of their perception of school climate. A common way of doing this is to work with raw scores, where we're probably all familiar with this, where we assign a numerical scale to that qualitative scale that we had. How true was it? We'll assign a number to each of those. So never true might be 0, and then always true might be 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3. And then we have their responses coded in such a way that we can add those numbers together and get some indication of how they were responding across items. So an example here, student 1, they were saying these elements are just never true in their perception, so they get a low raw score. We associate that student's perception with a low state of affairs as far as school climate goes. Whereas student 3 here on the other side of things, where those elements of school climate always true. So we say that student school climate is very positive as defined by the items. Let's talk about the difference, though, between a difficult item, which on a questionnaire is what items are students less likely to say is true. And this is one of those items. Students help decide school rules. It just so happens that most students say that this is just not the case. We don't necessarily want to jump into diagnosing why. This probably isn't a surprise, but it's just observed that most students say that this is untrue within their school climate. Whereas something that's very easy for people to endorse is, my teacher cares about me as a person. A lot of students say this is true, which is a very cool thing to see. So we know the distance between a 1 and a 2 in a number line is 1. The distance is always consistent. But what we're doing when we assign numbers to these qualitative response categories is we're making an assumption that the distance between those qualitative categories is consistent, always the same as numbers. And that's a questionable assumption. Sometimes it's more true than other times, and it depends on a lot of things. But you start to ask these questions: what's the difference between never true and mostly true? Is it consistent all the time? What's the distance between never true on one item and always true on a second item? Because we're relating in some way responses across these different items. We're making assumptions. So there are methods, and one common method of doing this, doing scoring in large scale testing is it has to do with something called item response theory. It's a calibration and scoring process that converts, in this case on a questionnaire, an ordinal response scale where it's qualitative. It's clear that there's an order to our response categories, but we're not sure the distance. It converts that ordinal scale to an interval scale where students are now described by their probability of reporting the existence these different school climate elements. And so that's like a one sentence rundown of the calibration process that's done to determine these scores. And we end up with something analogous to raw scores. They're often highly correlated, but these index scores and these scaled scores, they're better suited for mathematical calculations. So for example, finding the mean across a group, okay? So that's what we do. And we can do that because we have a lot of data available to us. And there are lots of benefits to doing it this way. We get those more thorough estimates and comparison of those latent traits, which is in this case, it's the student's perception, unobserved perception of the school climate. And another neat aspect of this is we can generalize interpretations over different sets of items if we're careful about how we relate them together in the calibration process. And so we're familiar with the idea of alternate forms. A student takes one form of a test and another student takes another form of the test. It's this kind of procedure that helps ensure that even though students are taking different sets of items, that their scores are comparable. It also gives us a convenient framework for establishing the comparability scores between grade level, between student groups, schools, districts, and years. So there's a lot of benefits to doing this. The scale was set and as a baseline to have a comparable scale from year to year, where in 2018 the mean was set to 50 and a standard deviation of 20. So most students, their scores are going to fall between 30 and 70 on our index scale. And really what this means is that a higher average score is going to indicate a more positive school climate across your dimensions and topics. And all those dimensions and topic scores are on the same scale from 1 to 99. So it allows us to make these comparisons. Let's start talking about a suggested workflow. There's a lot of data that comes out of this, a lot that's reported. And so let's just kind of break down a simple way of going about using it. So broadly speaking, the idea here is to use your mean index scores across your groups to identify meaningful differences in student response patterns across those groups. Then we also report that item response data to help explain why those scaled scores differ. And then also, you're going to want to include other data sources to corroborate your observations and test your hypotheses. So here's an example. We'll do some examples now. On the right-hand side, we have a set of school climate average scores across the state, and this is for the different grade levels. On the left-hand side is some guidance that's come out of previous work on the vocal to give some rough guidelines associated with what differences, what magnitude of scale score differences across the averages, across those means. What magnitude should grab your attention and how much? So for example, this mean difference here between grade 4 and 5, consider that a moderate 5-point difference. It's not nothing, it's not massive, but it's something that you could certainly notice and pay attention to and could drive further questions you might have. and we also observe a very large difference between the way in which the fourth graders were responding and the eighth graders. And so this is a larger magnitude of difference, and it signifies eighth grade students are responding in a pretty different way than the fourth grade students. Now, I'll mention a couple things here. There's nothing inherent in this process of calibration and scoring that hides or does away with any of the biases or caveats around administration. These scores are always just descriptive of the way students were responding to a questionnaire. We don't necessarily know why it is the case that students in eighth grade would be responding in a less favorable way than the fourth graders. That's work left to do to help understand that. I will say that part of that work is looking to the literature, for example, and it seems like this pattern of younger students having a pattern of rating things more favorably on questionnaires is a pattern compared to older students who tend to rate maybe lower comparatively. And so the difference in these scores could be from a number of things, something like that, where it's acquiescence of bias in the way people generally respond. It could be actual objective differences in the school climate. It could be a number of caveats with how it was administered. Those are hypotheses left to test. Things also get interesting in looking at, this is a single grade level, but looking at different student groups within that grade level, and we can use the same idea here. The difference between the set of Asian students responding here and the African American and Black students, a moderate difference overall on that overall school climate score, whereas we start to wonder maybe why is that the case, and we look at these other dimensions. Well, it looks like safety is quite a big difference here. So this helps us ask more questions, form hypotheses, and move along with working with the data, which is the next step of using item responses where you can to help understand what's going on behind those scores. This is an image of the dashboard, and we'll note. I just want to show you the yellow bar up top. It's a space where you'll need to make selections when you're using the dashboard. And here we're looking at grade 8, all students, engagement, and we're able to see the list of items that 8th graders responded to and the percent of students who responded within those different response categories, and also the number of students involved with this. And then we also provide this last metric here, the always or mostly true, as maybe a quick and easy way of sorting the general consensus on the item and a little bit of visualization there. At the school and district level, just be aware of the number of students included. Sometimes you'll get a small number of students, and sometimes a different number of students will respond to different items. So we're likely familiar with this idea where the number of students included where it's small, a single student is going to account for a larger percentage of the response rate, okay? The other thing here is just to note that there are suppression rules in the dashboard that are mentioned up top, and plenty of notes to pay attention to in the dashboard. Let's see. So here's a more filled in example of where we're going from looking at a difference in the index scores. So this is the safety index scores at a particular school, where the school mean, it was 42. And we can split that out by the different groups, and we observe again that the Black and African American students were responding less favorably to those items within safety. And so this is another page in the dashboard we'll look at when we get in there. But the idea here is we're going to have a comparison group, and there's going to be highlighting that comes up when there's a difference of 7 percentage points or more in a more or less favorable direction. So we'll see here This is the item: teachers, students, and the principal work together in our school to prevent and stop bullying. The consensus among all your students was 95% of them said always true or mostly true. But when you start disaggregating a little bit by the student groups, we see a different opinion among the different student groups. And because it's a difference of 7 or more, it's highlighted orange, and it's orange in that it's in a negative direction. And we go down the line here for the rest of the items. Again, that difference in the Black and African American index score average, you can see the trend here in less favorable ratings on these items. And so we're able to give more context to the way things were operating behind the score. One thing to note that gets a little confusing on looking at the items versus the index scores, it's the items some of them are reverse coded. And so some of them, like the one that's highlighted here with the asterisk, you actually want that to be low. It's more favorable school climate if that's a low percentage of students saying that is true. And so the highlighting adjusts for that, but that kind of like direction is a little bit different than how it works in the index scores, where no matter how the items are worded within the index scores, higher index score means more positive. It's just the nature of this reverse coding. And so it's just, when you're looking at the items, it's important to pay attention to the asterisks that are shown in the dashboard, and then the direction of the item. And then we also offer student climate profiles, and these are classifications based on cut scores to help give some like qualitative context around what it means to be a student around these cut scores. And it also helps with thinking about a distribution of where students' scores are. And the main recommendation here is to look within a grade level, because here there are documents on the our DESE Vocal website that kind of explain some of this information up top. It tells us around those cut scores, what does a student look like in their response pattern around those cut scores. And what I actually cut out here was a lot of qualitative narrative about the way that they're responding. And that qualitative narrative is going to be particular for a given grade level, because the items are different from grade level to grade level for the most part. When you're looking at items, it's a little more difficult to make sense of response rates on items between grade levels. So there is a sense in which you can say, if, for example, on the left image, if that was grade 4 rather than grade 5, and you said 40% of fourth graders were in the favorable range compared to grade 5, where 48 were in the favorable range, that's a fair comparison. But if you're trying to use trying to understand precisely what that means to be in that favorable range, you're going to want to restrict that to the grade level. And one of the really nice comparisons you can get out of this is if you compare like a school or a district to the state, to get a sense of what the distribution was locally compared to either the district or the state. Okay. So let's kind of start wrapping up the presentation piece with some guidance around index scores. So these are do's and don'ts. Nice. I don't know where that came from. But we'll go with it. Okay. I don't know if you can see this pink circle here, but we'll start reading off what is circled. The compare and identify and describe meaningful differences in student perceptions across schools, grades, dimensions, topics, student groups, and years. You can do that. We talked about that in the comparison. Do analyze patterns of index score differences year to year. Okay. You can monitor school climate scale scores over time, but again, going back to that idea that the scores are descriptive and they don't magically do away with some of the caveats around how it's administered. and it doesn't explain why students were responding in that way. So one example of this is 2021 scores are quite high compared to other years. One hypothesis there is it was administered at the time at which students were coming back into the classrooms. They hadn't spent an entire year at the school. So getting a student's perception of the school climate when they hadn't spent much time there and all that going on between those years, there's just some caution that you need to have when interpreting what that score means. And then if you're at a district and you want to see, for example, you want to calculate weighted index score averages, you can do that. So if you have like a type of schools and then a second type of schools, and you want to see what the difference was in those types of schools being in their response patterns on the survey, you can take a weighted average of how students were responding, and that can be useful for you. Compare student favorability scores, distributions to district and state, another good use. On the things we really don't recommend, don't use vocal data for administrative accountability purposes. I think the word accountability has multiple meanings. There are some senses in the word where, if you are using vocal or other data to drive conversations in this process of continuous improvement, and you kind of think of that as like people being accountable to one another locally to think about how their part in the school climate, that's a frame in which accountability is nice. But like administrative accountability purposes, where we kind of think about tying consequences to just data, just without that descriptive data, without understanding why the data is the way it is. Don't recommend that. The vocal is not the spirit of doing the student questionnaire. We're really trying to get a student's perspectives on what's going on at the school and use that information as one of many data sources to use in thinking about how to make things good. I don't recommend going from hypothesis to fact too quickly here. Vocal data, again, they're descriptive of student perspectives, and in particular, their response patterns on a questionnaire. Additional data sources are going to be important for you to bring in testing hypotheses that explain observations, and that ranges from qualitative data, you talking to people out there, and quantitative data. What other kind of school climate data can you come up with locally to help you understand what's going on? And then don't forget about sample size. Remember, small sample sizes kind of throw a wrench in how we're able to interpret both averages and response rates on questions. Item response data guidance. Now, do recommend use this information to make meaning of index scores differences where there are common items. So your grade to grade comparisons, so we talked about this, comparing 4th to 8th grade using item responses is going to be a little difficult because you don't have many common items. There are some, but not many, and it's a little sketchy to be mapping on items. Some are better than others to be mapping like that, but you'll have more success, and it's probably a better use of time to be using the item response comparisons within a grade level to compare student groups. And keep the qualifications in mind. Again, student questionnaire, end of year, administered with the MCAS. And we want to keep this low inference. So saying something like X% of 4th grade students reported that whatever is quite a different framework to approaching the data than looking at it and just coming out the gate with saying bullying is rampant here. We want to keeping a low inference to start helps us kind of warm up the idea that these are hypotheses to test. And do assess the distribution of student responses across those 4 response options. We know that central tendency, means, and so forth mask variance or variability in student scores. So you can see whether students were really gravitating to one category or were they spread out among others. And then you can rank order items based on how favorable students were responding to them, and you're able to do that sorting within the dashboard. Don't recommend averaging the response category codes, that 0, 1, 2, 3. Again, it's a practice. It's done typically when researchers have to. We don't have to here, and so I don't recommend doing that. Don't directly compare the response percentages across dimensions or grades. And so just again, that idea that trying to compare uncommon items gets sketchy and is not recommended. And same idea here, don't compare uncommon item response rates between groups. Like radically different questions or dimensions, not necessarily the best use of time. Okay. So these are additional resources. Again, we'll send this out to you with links. There's also, if you can look for our DESI Vocal website that has all these resources listed as well. Let's start now talking about how you access the data. And I'm doing good on time. Okay. So this data lives in Edwin. And one of the caveats here that's been a little bit of a trip is that it requires both the permissions granted by your director or administrator, both for the district and the school level. The intention here is to kind of lock down school level results for the individual school leaders, and not cross sharing automatically school climate data across folks at different schools. And so if you're at the district, you need both your district level set, and for each school that you want to see, you need it set as well. If you run into questions with that, we can help answer that offline. What you end up seeing is this school climate bucket, and you get this vocal dashboard access, and then the VC301, which is your spreadsheets. So let's get out of PowerPoint here and start looking at what these files look like. And I'll do a new share here. Let's start by showing you the spreadsheets. We're not going to go too in depth into them, but I just want to show you what's available. So this is an example of an index score spreadsheet report. And what I did was I took out the district and school names to keep them anonymous, not calling them out. And you'll see here up the top some descriptive information about what you're looking at, the district. When you download one of these, you get the district aggregates, the means, as well as each school, their aggregates, and the state. So you have a lot of data to work with. There's going to be a row for each grade level and for each student group. So here we see the African American Black group here, their aggregates, the all students group, and if we went down, we got the other student groups. Okay. And then moving across the header here, it's the number of students included in this this mean index score calculation. Here are those red starred dimensions that this is the mean index score for this student group within this grade. Okay. And then the next set of columns is those topic scores that we only report at the all students group. Okay. We need at least 50 students to have that. And then we have also only for the all students group, the number and percent of students looking at who are in each range of each classification of the favorability for that index score. Okay. And sorry, that's overall school index score. Okay. So that's the rundown of the index score spreadsheet. I'll show you now the response items or item response spreadsheet. Again, you'll have district codes, district names, school names here. But again, the idea is each row is going to represent an item. And also for that grade level, that student group, and that within what dimension it is, and the item code, the item number. So here's an example of that suppression rule. They only had 9 students responding to these items, so it's not reported. We have to scroll way down. And these are very large files. My goodness. So here we start getting student response rates at 10 students. And it shows you the number of students involved, the number who reported in each category, and then the percent who reported each category for that student group and that item and that grade level. I will recommend like the dashboard, some feedback we're receiving, the dashboard does not print very well. And so this is an example of if you have someone on staff who knows pivot tables in Excel, even though this is a very large spreadsheet, like very large, using pivot tables can help tremendously with making a custom report. So for example, if I want to look at 5th grade responses, I can set this up in a way with a pivot table to have just a clear, easy to print list of the items with the response rates, and it can come out all on one page. And we're working on a way to make that a little bit easier for folks locally, whether it's guidance or PD on how to do that with pivot tables, or improved reporting practices on our end. But I just want to give that pro tip there. Pivot tables can be very helpful. Okay, let's jump in to looking at dashboards. And what I'm going to show you is the state level dashboard that's available here on our Vocal website. Tons of information here. Again, a lot of guidance materials and guides, as well as past webinars. We have the Vocal survey content, the actual questionnaires that students see. So you can share those with parents and guardians, and you can even use those to do read alouds if you would like. Let's see, past webinar slide decks, and then also validity reports that have research that backs the use of these scores. Okay, so I'm going to hop in here to this state dashboard. On your end, when you're going through Edwin, you are going to go like here, school climate, and then you would go to this Vocal dashboard within Edwin. And I'm not going to show you the one in Edwin, unfortunately, because I don't want to display anyone's data for everyone to see. But just know when I'm going over the state dashboard, there's additional selections you will need to make at the top here, in particular on this front homepage. Because if you don't select up here on the front homepage, the rest of it won't populate. So that's a key to keep in mind. And then on the other tabs, just keep in mind that this bar up here is going to force you to make some selections at times, okay? So let's go to this state level dashboard that's available for the public to see. They largely are very similar, look the same. So the one place to start is this getting started button right here. This brings you to some contextual information, interpretive information, how to use the rest of the dashboard. And we'll click to go back to home. And let's start. We can select the year that you want to look in. Participation rates is the first tab that we have available to us. And you just get to see what number and percent of students were responding at your schools or districts and at the state. Okay, so we get a pretty good response rate to this, even though it is voluntary. And I'll shout out if you know that folks in your school or district isn't using this yet, they don't administer it yet, encourage you to, advocate for it. Ask me questions too. I'm happy to advocate for it. It can be very useful information for folks. So moving on to the school results tab. Here we're going to see the average index scores by the grade level. So we saw this in the presentation. If you hover over some of these, it will give you more contextual information. So we get the favorability classifications here when you hover over, and other information. And again, just able to see quickly what the means were. And then you have up here the dimensions. You can toggle between the dimensions and topics. Here we see the participation, bullying, and instructional environment topic scores. Also up here is this little green eye. This gives you some information on what can this answer, what questions can this answer, and what to be looking for on this screen. Also, direct your attention down here where it says contact us. You can use this button on your dashboard to shoot us an email, and I'll get it and be able to help you out if you have any questions. As is that resource button brings you to the website. Item responses. Here's an example of where we must make a selection. So let's go grade 8. And we can, if we would like, we can select a student group. And we can select a dimension, which dimension of view items for. And here's a list of the items, the number of students included in this breakdown, the percent responding to each category, and then this little quick metric here we use always or mostly true. It just adds together the students who are responding to those two categories as a quick way of sorting and viewing and ranking items in terms of their how they were responding. Also pay attention to these notes up here. So you see data are suppressed with student responses included as fewer than 10. So there's different suppression rules at different places, and that's one of them for the screen. It will show up in the note up there, and other notes as well. Just some of these are reverse coded, so paying attention to that, and so forth. So that's that screen. Student group results. We go back to the index scores, but disaggregated by those different student groups. And also up here on this note is there was a little bit of a change in how the low income and the economically disadvantaged was used to filter students or aggregate students. And so different years will use what, in the past it was economically disadvantaged, and now it's back to low income. So here's a screen where you see the comparisons among student groups. And again, if you, that orange dot is going to be the state, average index score for all students. And you're actually able to select which comparison group on your dashboards that orange dot represents. Moving along to more item responses, here's that report that we saw in the presentation that highlights the difference, if there's a big enough difference between the way that the reference group was responding, which for us up here is going to be all students. For the state, we don't really filter by these others. We just keep it all students, and but you'll be able to select and narrow it down to a comparison group that you want to see, and select their dimension here, see different items. And then again, we see that highlighting if different student groups are responding in a different way, they'll be highlighted here. Trend results gets us into comparing average index scores across different student groups. So we select our grade 8 here. We need to select a grade, and we can filter by different student groups. So we start with all students. We see here, that trend of that not a trend, but 2021 just being kind of students responding in a more favorable way that year. That was kind of an outlier compared to other years. And then you can select your other student groups if you want to see over time what the differences in the index scores has been. And you can see here is 2021 data should be viewed with caution. Student perceptions were likely influenced by the COVID pandemic and return to in-person learning. So you can use that to track over time. And lastly, that favorability trend gets into the classifications that we looked at with the percent of students within different favorability ranges. And we only are showing 2022 and 2023 currently because 2022 is when those benchmarks were reset. Okay. So I think that is the presentation part. Here is my contact information, my email, and my phone number. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email, and we can now open it up to questions from folks. So whether you want to have it in the chat, it looks like maybe Kate, looks like things were answered along the way.
I did try to do most of it. A lot of the questions that came in, I was able to answer, and actually some of them you then answered in your presentation going forward. But just to review some of them, no, I can't scroll up. So again, you pointed out a lot of resources we have on the Vocal webpage that can help with some of that local analysis, including, I really think the interpretive guide and action planning template is like a great tool and encourage folks to take a look at that. We also have the grade level school climate profiles and a user guide. So again, tons of information there. I sent you just that one link because instead of sending all the little links, there's also an FAQ, and that hits on some of the sort of testing, who's tested when, what are the conditions, and some of those types of questions. So unless someone's looked at that and said, oh, I have another one, I think we've hit on that one. I will say somebody mentioned, I'm curious, what if this wasn't done during MCAS? I understand that that question. I know my impression is the cost. Really, it's cost prohibitive for us to do this undertaking at a different time. Is I think probably the real world answer. And I think another challenge, and this might be related to the cost, is ensuring that there are similar testing conditions when it's not tied to MCAS is also potentially problematic. But I don't know, Brendan, if you've done research or if there's sort of other thinking. I know you're much more sort of tied.
Well, one hypothesis I have about it, I only answer the question directly, but I would expect to see different trends in responding from the closer to the beginning of the year compared to the end of the year,
and we're end of year, yeah.
And we're end of year, and
endish.
Just based on prior experience I had on running a survey with AmeriCorps members, it was just the case that the beginning of the year was always much more positively rated than the end of year. I don't know if that would be the case with students on this questionnaire. It would be interesting. And I do agree and hear you on some of the challenges with administering during MCAS. It's a time when students are doing a lot of work that we're asking them to do. And this is one more thing. Maybe a good thing about that is hopefully they can appreciate that they're being asked these questions that ask them their opinion rather than trying to get measure their academic skills. So
yeah,
we definitely hear that, and it's something to think about in the future for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, I do always think the vocal, it's very much like in the last 30 days, have you experienced bullying or have this happened? And I just always wonder, that's sometimes a hard frame for kids to keep in mind. And so
I will say, sorry, going back again just to that idea that this is a living program. And so, you know, part of my job here and part of what I'm doing is figuring out, building off the great work that's been done, hearing feedback from you all. So please keep that coming, and seeing where we can get these efficiencies and demands met. So, were there other questions?
So some of the other ones came. One had to do, like, it has to do with I think the printing challenge, which you were commenting on doing pivot tables with the Excel downloads, and I think that there's two ways that you can get this data is the big thing, and one is the VC 301 report, which are going to be those tabular paginated reports that you can export to Excel and then do some additional modification to. And that is sort of one way to get the data. And especially if you want like the underlying data or to do additional stuff, the tabular report might be the way to go if you want to merge it with other things. Or do some additional analysis. But then the visual dashboard is sort of a different way to get in. You really, it can help sort of narrow the focus, I think, and make it be a little more bite-sized than a multi-page, multi-column report where you can say, all right, I'm just focusing on engagement of grade 4. Let me see what's going on. Let me look at the item. Let me look at the index and things like that. So you can sort of parse in. The downside of that, and this is a Power BI Microsoft issue, is it's really hard to print that. And it's hard to share. Like, it is designed to be that exploration tool. And it's not quite as easy to sort of pull out and share as like a slide deck with people. Like, you definitely need to do sort of screenshots. So that's what I sort of recommend. If you're not going to use the VC 301 report and do some modification to make it printable or shareable in that way, I recommend screenshotting the dashboard and then pasting that in either a PowerPoint slide or Word doc or something in order to share it. And some of those like item responses, you might have to scroll and do 2 screenshots that you stack. And it's an awkward workaround, but it's like the current workaround we have. We're complaining to Microsoft and hoping that they do something with it. But sort of some of those questions came in. And then the only other thing is the access to this. The state version of the report card is on that local webpage. If you want your individual school or district, you have to log into Edwin, go to that school climate folder where you find the report in the dashboard. And then, assuming you have the right Edwin security roles, like you have that school and that district role, you will see your school and district in there. But this is a little bit different than some of our other dashboards where it's like you can't look up another school or district's dashboard to compare yourself to. So just as a heads up, that is a limitation right now with how we share our vocal data.
Yes.
But so those are that's some of what it is. Yes, the snip and sketch as a tool. Yeah, I use the snipping tool all the time.
Yeah, and I would say there's actually a little bit of benefit to that, because if your objective is to bring some